Welcome back to Mike and Maurice's Mind Escape. Let us help you escape your mind. All right, folks, welcome back to Mike and Maurice's Mind Escape. We have episode number 260 today. It's going to be a fantastic episode. We have our good buddy, Dr. Rick Strassman, back on the show for the third time. And if you're interested after this episode, go check out the links for our first two episodes we did with him, as well as he was just on Rogan recently. I thought that was a great interview as well, so go check that out.
Absolutely.
Before we get started, Rick has a new book out called the Psychedelic Handbook. I have the link down below at the bottom, as well as the link to all of his books, The Spirit Molecule, The Soul of Prophecy, Joseph Levy Escapes Death, all those wonderful books. Please go check those out. And if you don't know who Rick is currently an American Clinical Adjunct Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine. From 1990 to 1995, he led a U.S. government-approved and funded clinical research team at the University of New Mexico, studying the effects of N-Dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, on human subjects in experimental conditions. He's also the president and co-founder of the Cottonwood Research Institute. And again, check out his books, The Spirit Molecule, which is probably the one most people recognize, Inner Paths to Outer Space, DMT, The Soul of Prophecy, Joseph Levy Escapes Death, and of course his new one, which we will talk about today, The Psychedelic Handbook. And again, go follow him, go support him. I have all the links down below. And if you want to support our show, all you have to do is click the Linktree link down below. We'd really appreciate that. We have a Patreon segment with Rick from last time. We're going to do one today. And we've got a merch store. And the best way to support the show is honestly just go to Apple Podcast or Spotify and leave us a 5-star review. We really appreciate that. But without further ado, welcome back on the show. Rick, how are you?
Thanks, Mike and Maurice. I'm doing good. I'm doing well. How about you guys?
Great.
Good.
Glad to have you back on. I just got finished with your new book. It's short, but it's sweet. It's got a lot of great info in there. What was your reasoning for writing this new one? Obviously, you mainly focused on DMT in the past, but this one's got a little bit of everything from Psilocybin and LSD to MDMA and all that stuff.
Well, I was mostly interested in putting together a practical handbook to kind of introduce people to the field who may not know much about it. I think of it as a textbook, more or less a small textbook. With the explosion of interest, both media, commercial, academic, research, spiritual, in psychedelics, I feel a sense of responsibility, I suppose, with having opened up the field in the U.S. with my work in the 90s, and I want to try to keep it on track. I think that there's a lot of glorification of potential benefits and minimizing of potential adverse effects with all of the hype that's occurring in the space, and I wanted to present, the facts as best I could from somebody with a lot of experience in the field. I started, developing an interest in psychedelics in college. Went to medical school, psychiatry, clinical research fellowship, and all of that. The melatonin work, the pineal work, the DMT and psilocybin work, and I've been current, even though we wrapped up the studies 28 years ago, or I guess 27 years ago now. I've been mentoring students, keeping an eye on all of the academic research, giving lectures, refereeing, manuscripts which are, submitted to, scientific journals for publication. So I have a good, perspective on the field. I've, been doing it a long time. I've, sat for a lot of, psychedelic sessions. I've, taken a lot of psychedelic drugs, done a lot of meditation, but, been through psychoanalysis. So I think I have a good perspective on the field, and figured it was a good time to, kind of, present a balanced perspective. Y- y- Neither as an advocate or as an opponent, but just the facts and
Yeah, I
uh,
thought that was
some of
interest.
my opinions, which I think are fairly well reasoned.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting thing too. Is in your book, you're not just advocating, like you said, you actually present some of the risks with some of these compounds as well, which I think is needed because, I mean, you should have reverence for these compounds. I mean, when I was younger, and when Maurice was younger, we would just take these things. There wasn't a whole lot. We're talking 20, 15, 20 years ago. There wasn't a lot of information other than Irwin, in terms of dosage and plateaus and things like that. So I think this is needed because I don't see enough of that out there. There's a lot of like, nerding out on stuff, which we do on the show, and I love that too. Some of the more, the science and the in-depth stuff, but I think you need that basic platform to work off of, and I don't think enough people have that coming into that. I mean, the only person I can think of is maybe Michael Pollan's stuff, but yeah, even that's kind of in depth too. So I really appreciate what you did with this book because we do need like sort of a basic guide or breakdown of all this stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that Pollan is an engaging writer. Uh, but he isn't a therapist. He isn't a clinician. He's not a researcher. He's not a scientist. So his perspective, I think, even though it's engaging, isn't quite, based on the real world.
Yeah, I agree. I was actually kind of critical of some of the stuff he's left out of his book, and even more recently his Netflix special. So yeah, I mean, while I appreciate that aspect of it, you're right. He's not any of those things. So um, let's go through each one of these things. Like in the past, I think the first episode we had you on, you kind of walked us through one of your main entity experiences that you had when you smoked DMT with Terrence McKenna in the 80s. But is there anything in terms of like from you doing ayahuasca, something similar or an experience that you could share or some wisdom that you can impart?
From my own drug experiences, I don't do drugs that much anymore. I mean, I smoke pot, but that's, just to relax and to be creative.
Pots,
Uh,
come on. We're not adding that. No, I'm joking. Edibles maybe, but
yeah,
It
yeah.
depends on
So
how often you do it. I haven't smoked in probably two years now. If I smoked, I'd be launched into the stratosphere.
yeah, well, especially
You know
with
what I'm
kind
saying?
of super
Product
high
now, yeah.
octane
Mm.
cannabis out there now. Um, well, I mean, the first time I ever smoked cannabis, I don't know if we talked about that. It was when I was 18, and I'd been drunk once before in my whole life. Um, Yeah, so I was a college freshman. Our senior resident advisor came by, knocked on my door, and said, "Oh, I hear you haven't ever been stoned before. It's my responsibility as as your student advisor, to get you stoned." So he pulled out a tin foil package of blonde Lebanese hash, and we smoked and smoked and smoked, and yeah, it was a completely psychedelic experience. There were purple clouds coming out of my speakers. The floor gave way under me, and I was flying over, Claremont, California, with my roommate who, shared the experience with me. We were, pointing out things together. Um, yeah, and I felt calm. I felt happy. And well, I started, college as a chemistry major, and I put, two and two together and thought, you know, in a half hour, or, like a half hour ago, things were not this way, and they are this way now, and that's because of chemistry. There, must be, some chemistry, going on that is responsible, or at least, mediating this incredible alteration in perspective. So in a way, that, kind of, gave me the bug. That's, kind of how I began this, path of, studying the biology of consciousness, specifically from the, psychedelic platform.
Yeah, the you know smoking or experiencing cannabis for the first time or one of the first times, very interesting, because you'll never achieve that level again, right? I mean, that's not a myth when people say that. I think it's because of it's something new. It's like, maybe this is a bad analogy, but it's kind of like your first day of high school or something. You're nervous, you don't know what to expect, and then you're like, whoa, it just blows your mind. Um, Same thing with that. I think that you'll never achieve that because there's so much like hype and wonderment around it that I think when you actually experience it, it's that much more memorable as opposed to, let's say, smoking every day or whatever, or vaping or whatever.
Yeah, it's completely novel. It's the first time you've been there. It's, I suppose, like going to India for the first time. Yeah, it's, like it's completely unexpected, completely, it's a whole different reality.
It's magical in a sense. I remember because we go on this canoe trip every year, and I remember I smoked probably a week before the canoe trip, and I knew on the canoe trip that there's going to be people with cannabis there, so I was all pumped up and ready to partake in some activities there. But it just had uh, a magical sense to it. And then I remember when we got to the canoe trip, we couldn't get anything because everybody smoked it all. And our one cousin rolled up a beaner and some papers and gave it to us. And I mean, we're
Mhm.
kids; you don't know what's
Yeah, I
going
mean, I
on.
think we were,
So
what, 13 years old or something at the
I
time.
don't know about that, but it's.
Oh,
I
I
remember
do.
actually the first time I smoked, I didn't know if I was high or not, and it's kind of what I've been telling people with mushrooms. Like, I remember back in high school days, they're like, "Oh, I don't know if I tripped or not." It's like you would know. And that first time I smoked, I wasn't really high. I just thought I was. Then the second time I did it, then I was high, and I there was no question about it. So, but yeah, when you're doing stuff, I almost equate it to like listening to a song for the first time. When you hear like music and stuff, there is a magical quality, and you get high essentially off of it. But then after you listen to that song over and over and over again, it kind of loses its charisma. So you kind of have to treat things in moderation, if you will.
Yeah, yeah, there's tolerance.
Um, yeah, I mean, obviously the tolerance, but I do think, again, I remember from like using like psychedelics in my past. I do remember the first time I've done each of those compounds for the first time more than the following times.
Totally.
So I do think that there's something to that. Um, but yeah, so you mentioned cannabis kind of getting you into there. It's amazing too. Like, if you would have told me 20 years ago or whatever, when I was in high school, that cannabis would be legal, like recreationally legal where I live, I'd tell you you're crazy. But here we are. Um, I know there's still debate on the national level, but we have a lot of states kind
That's
of,
ridiculous too.
yeah,
Let me add that point.
going that way. It's something that grows from the earth. And obviously there's arguments to be made about other compounds and things like that, but specifically cannabis and the history of the interactions with human beings and everything, it just doesn't make sense. Do you think that psychedelics are kind of going to go the same way as cannabis, or do you think there's going to be more of like a sweeping national policy thing happening?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think this, decriminalization, legalization thing is, focusing, mostly on psilocybin. But if it were, focusing mostly instead on LSD, I think that the discussion would be, different somehow. And I think, that's one of the reasons that academic centers began studying psilocybin instead of LSD after our work began or was completed, actually. Um, there was a study came out of Germany maybe a couple of months ago comparing the acute effects of psilocybin with LSD in the same people, and there was no difference at all. The only difference was in the time course. So if the discussions for legalizing psilocybin, if you just replace the word psilocybin with LSD, I think people would be a bit more cautious, a bit more circumspect with respect to the uh, you know f- uh, the kind of casualness with which this increased accessibility to psilocybin is being promoted. Um, Psychedelics, at least when you take an active dose, are psychedelic. They're really mind blowing, and cannabis, when you use an active dose, it's not psychedelic. You can smoke a lot of strong cannabis extremely quickly and trip. But generally it's used recreationally. You're watching TV with your friends. You're taking a walk in the woods. But a full dose of psilocybin or LSD, you should stay home and be careful and have have somebody that you can call or who's looking out for you.
Set and setting.
It's the set and setting and educating yourself to optimize the the benefit and to minimize the adverse effects. So I think it'll come down to scheduling when we're talking about the national level. Will the DEA deschedule or reschedule psychedelics? I don't think that's around the corner, even though FDA might give the stamp of approval of using specific psychedelics for specific conditions, but within uh, um, within the medical model. But still, it depends on the scheduling of these compounds. If they're still Schedule One, that's a huge headache to get a Schedule One permit. Um,
Weren't they?
and
They were trying to schedule like 4 research compounds recently, and I know that they kind of reeled it back because I know Hamilton Morris was making a stink about it, and a couple other people, and they got him to kind of rethink it. Did you hear about that?
yeah, it was a number of short-acting tryptamines. Um, yeah. Well, those are pretty obscure drugs, and the data that the DEA was using to put them in Schedule One, wasn't especially thorough. Uh, so they backtracked. But I think for very popular compounds for which there's a lot of information, and they're still in Schedule One. I think it'll be a bit more of an uphill climb to reschedule them.
Yeah, I know psilocybin's one of the safer ones on the LDI scale. Or I think it is the
Yeah, well,
safest one from what I remember.
yeah, yeah. Well, physically, psychedelics, the classical, compounds are extremely safe. It's the psychological morbidity or adverse effects which can be troublesome. That's one of the things which is overlooked when there's an argument being made that psychedelics are safe. The LD50 is extremely high, those kinds of things. But on the other hand, they can traumatize you. They can trigger psychosis and depression and panic attacks and whatnot. There could be accidents, suicides, flashbacks, those kinds of things. So that isn't taken into account when people are describing the physical safety of the classical compounds, which is quite good.
Yeah. Um, from a mental health standpoint, what do you think it is about them where like we're using them to help people that are either in psychosis or have mental health issues, but then it can also trigger that in some people? Like that's a weird dichotomy, right? That something can either help people or push them into that exact state. Like what do you think's going on there?
Well, it's a question of set and setting and the dose. Uh, if you're especially fragile, for whatever reason, your genetics or your drinking or your history of trauma, and you take a big amount of a classical compound or any compound in unstable, unsafe, threatening environment, you're going to freak out, chances are. And if you're, prone to psychosis, it could be the last straw. But uh, if you're stable, healthy mentally and physically, you've got a strong support system. You're doing well in your life. You take a small dose and you take a hike in the woods with a couple of close friends. Chances are it'll be a good day. So you really need to clarify your intent, what drug you're going to take, what kind of dose. In a way, it's like radiation. I mean, a small amount of radiation can be curative for certain kinds of cancers, let's say. But a large amount, like an explosion, nuclear explosion, let's say, is going to be dangerous. So it's the proper dose and set setting intention.
Absolutely. And I want to give a shout out to our producer Shane, who's in Boston right now for Wounded Warrior, and our social media guy Chase. He says to say hi, and Toby, our co-host on our new podcast, the Roswell UFO Symposium. Shout out to all those wonderful gentlemen. Actually, Shane, I think, is considering doing this thing. Have you ever heard of this program? It's called Heroic Hearts, I think is the name of it, where they go
Yeah.
down and they do ayahuasca.
Yeah, I think I've maybe spoken with them. I'm not sure. I have spoken to a couple of veterans that are doing psychedelic uh, work with their comrades with PTSD.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a lot of work to be done with that. And, it's something we talk about a lot too, the mental health stuff. Um, I found that with talking with tons of people on like Twitter Spaces and Twitter and different communities, whether it be the psychedelic community, the esoteric community or the UFO community, whatever it is, there's a lot of people that have trauma, PTSD, mental health stuff going on. I mean, I'm under the impression now personally, and I don't know if you feel the same way, but there is no such thing as like normal or somebody that's considered to have no mental issues whatsoever. Like, I think at very least we've all had depression, right? So this idea of happiness and, achieving this state of happiness and just being a normal person, I think is kind of a myth. I don't know if you feel the same way.
Yeah, it kind of points to the notion that nobody is free of trauma. Even Freud spoke about the or one of Freud's students, Otto Rank, spoke about the birth trauma. Everybody's got the trauma of being born. You're floating around in amniotic fluid in the womb, and boom, you're in the bright lights. uh, there's all kinds of noise and wind and breezes and things on your skin. Yeah, and everybody's got problems. I'm not sure if everybody's been depressed. I mean, everybody goes through periods of feeling sad, feeling hopeless, perhaps even. But clinical depression, it's quite frequent, and so is post-traumatic stress disorder. I think it's a matter of degree. When it becomes something which interferes with your life or your well-being.
Absolutely. I mean,
Well,
I mean,
speaking of veterans, I'm consulting with a group at UCLA now, that's interested in a study using repeated dosing of DMT to treat PTSD in veterans, and it's going to be building off of a study we did, which attempted to develop tolerance to closely spaced repeated dosing of DMT over the course of a morning. And you don't develop tolerance. Like if you give a big dose, 4 times with 30-minute intervals, dose 4 is as intense as the first dose. And you can do psychotherapy in between doses, and it seems to follow a interesting progression of psychological work. um, so even though most people are thinking of MDMA for PTSD, and even ketamine, there was a Yale paper came out a couple of months ago about treating your PTSD with ketamine. But I think other compounds, other classical compounds, will start seeing some use as well.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for doing that work too. Like I said, there's a lot of people that need a lot of help out there, and as much as these things are fun, or maybe when you're younger, it's interesting to experiment with these things. I have the utmost reverence and respect for these compounds, and seeing what they've done for some people is just amazing. So I want to kind of go through a couple of your book. You kind of break down the different compounds and kind of go through it that way. What's your favorite? What's your favorite species of mushroom? I know a lot of people are talking about the penis envy.
That's been going around lately.
That's the that's for me. That's been the most potent and creative. And this question was asked by our buddy Chase. He wanted to know what your favorite strain was, and then also how much of do you think the variability from different species or strain do you think affects that experience?
Yeah, I just don't know, to be honest. I've not, looked into the potency of the different strains. You would imagine, certain strains are stronger than others, and even then, it would, depend on, the growth conditions, the media, the humidity, temperature, things like that. Um, Back in the day when I was, taking mushrooms on, any kind of, regular basis, it was just, cubensis that my friends were growing in their basement, and yeah, so. But my favorite psychedelic, I suppose, would be psilocybin mushrooms. It's a good length. You can take a low dose, medium dose, or a big dose. And you could sidestep the nausea if you're prone to it.
Have you ever done any of the sacred mushroom rituals with anybody, or because I know there's a different way of doing it where they eat live mushrooms, and there's an element of honey and cacao and things like that. Have you ever experienced anything like that, and do you think that has an impact on the experience?
Oh yeah. So personally, I've not done a mushroom ceremony per se, like with singing and healing and things. Um, More recreational, or I'm outdoors or with friends. You can, one of the things that I like about mushrooms is you can make a tea and just, drink as much as you want over the course of the day. Titrate, the level of intoxication, to the, circumstances.
Yeah, the tea thing's interesting to me because I feel like when I drink the tea, it comes on quicker and goes by faster. It's maybe more intense in certain spots, but it goes by quicker than when I masticate the stems and caps and do it that way.
Yeah, well, that's the reason you keep your water bottle next to you. You can drink more, or hold off, depending on what you're looking for.
Interesting. Our friend Leah wanted to know, what do you think of the interplanetary, or the play between psychedelics and spiritual emergence?
Spiritual emergency.
Yes.
Well, that in a way is a reframing of an adverse effect, as opposed to it being a psychotic break or a panic attack episode or things like that. You can reframe it as a spiritual emergency. Back in the day, there was an anti-psychiatry mm, uh, movement which was quite strong actually, and is especially focused on schizophrenia and psychosis. One of the promoters of that point of view was R.D. Lang. Another fellow was Thomas Zaz, John Perry. y- 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 um, they treated schizophrenia as a spiritual disorder, and they believed that if you gave drugs to break or to stop a schizophrenic episode, you were interfering with spiritual growth. And I think in a very, very, very small number of people that's true. I'd say, I don't know, 1%. Um, otherwise,
I asked the question wrong, so I want to reframe that. She was asking the interplay between psychedelics and spiritual emergence. So like your book, The Soul of Prophecy. I know that has to do with more of speculating on what was going on with the
oh,
prophets and
oh,
things
I
like that.
see.
But like, what do you think the connection is between spiritual emergence and psychedelics?
Yeah, well, I guess spirituality or spiritual growth or or spiritual evolution. Well, it just depends on the set and the setting and the drug and the dose. If you're a spiritual person, if spiritual questions occupy yourself, if you read spiritual texts, if you belong to a spiritual community, if you practice spiritual techniques or methodologies, then your trips will most likely concern spiritual things, spiritual feelings and thoughts, which will become clearer, hopefully more true, more convincing. You become more dedicated to your spiritual practice. If you think of yourself as a non-spiritual person, even as an atheist, let's say, and you have like what you would then after the fact call a spiritual experience on psychedelics, um, I don't think it's a result of the drug making you think something new, but it just uncovers or un, uh, it uncovers or sheds light on things which were more or less conscious in the first place. And, like for example, if you're an atheist, you still may wish that there were a God, and you've got the slightest doubt. Well, maybe there is a God, or 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 you hope that there is a God. You, so, um, so you trip and you experience something which you consider to be God's presence or God's manifestation. You can attribute that to the drug, but I think it's more the case that instead of the drug being entheogenic, generating God within you, it's um, psychedelic. It's manifesting what's already in your mind, which was just dimly conscious. Um, Stan Groff likes to say that psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers of the unconscious. But I think they're non-specific amplifiers of things which are more or less conscious. So you may want to be ecologically minded, but uh, you- um, but you just don't know how, and you trip and you get some clarity. So that is material in your mind which is already conscious, or the example of an atheist, it's unconscious, your belief in God or your wish for there to be a God, and then it's made more conscious more real, uh, more true than it was before.
Yeah, interesting. Um, to stay on the psilocybin and mushroom thing before we move on, for me, that's the one that's, psilocybin's my favorite compound I've experienced, probably a few hundred times. Not any, I haven't done that much, recently. I'm kind of on psychedelic hiatus, but, um, you know, some of my best ideas, sitting in darkness and meditating on it and then recording and writing things down within that. So you come out of it and some things don't make any sense, but I still keep it around to ponder it to see if there's maybe something that comes back like an old dream or something like that. But then there's really great insights too. And we were talking about the difference between psilocybin and LSD. For me, LSD has just been way too heady. A lot of my experiences were when I was younger at like fish shows, but I have done it with a proper set and setting and kind of like how I've done psilocybin, and I still didn't really love it. I know people do love it. I know that's some people's favorite compound. It's too long for me. Real quick, there's a quick story when I was a long time ago when I was working at Guitar Center in my early 20s. I took a hit probably like 5 or 6 o'clock the night before, and had an experience all night, and then had to go into work the next day at like 10 a.m. And when I got there, I walked into the Guitar Center, and all the guitars kind of turned to one color, and I started to have this kind of like melting feeling, and I'm like, oh shit, I'm still in the grips of this thing. So yeah, there's an element of that that I think I didn't like about it. Not that I don't like that experience, but I just think it's like too long, So maybe I would have been served better by like the microdosing aspect of it, which you see a lot of people, Silicon Valley and artists and creative minds doing these days. But yeah, I mean, how do you feel about that? Do you think that that's why some people? It seems like more people gravitate towards psilocybin. It's more relatable for most people.
Yeah. Well, well, you were talking about the duration of action of LSD, and that's a drawback. It can be 12 hours or even longer. There's an interesting metabolite of LSD which only appears toward the end of one's experience at the 8 hour point or so. Um, which is more it's more active within the dopamine system. The classical compounds are believed to exert their effects through activation of serotonin receptors. But there's a breakdown product of LSD which is more active at the dopamine system. So that uncomfortable feeling, that kind of jangly, slightly paranoid state that lots of people get into toward the end of an LSD session, could be the result of that unusual metabolite. Smaller doses, can be easier to negotiate as well. Microdosing is, kind of a mixed, bag right now. The research is, well, the laboratory, research is extremely meager when it comes to microdosing, and people don't even agree what microdosing is. Is it a completely inactive, dose, where there isn't any subjective effect at all, or
Hmm.
is it a small, like a small dose, which is slightly stimulating, let's say, or a slightly higher dose, which puts sparkle on the room. So uh, you can call all three of those subs psychedelic doses microdoses, but they do different things subjectively, and they probably are doing different things pharmacologically as well. The dosing regimen is important too. Like, is it every day, once a week, once a month, every other day? So the kinks have yet to be worked out with the whole microdosing story.
Yeah, I
Yeah, I've
know.
had conversations with people about that before. They're like, "Oh, I'm not microdosing. I'm taking point 0.5." I was like, "I don't know if that's technically microdosing, but I
Yeah,
guess.
you were microdosing, weren't you, Maurice, for a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I was taking .1 to .2, so I consider microdosing taking an amount where you don't really notice any of the effects. As far as, I mean, you might feel, it almost feels like you just had a cup of coffee or something like that, but I would consider the other doses a light dose or a threshold dose. But that's, again, that's kind of just where I'm coming from.
Yeah, we've had Adam Bramlage on, who he's doing a lot of work with microdosing, and I think the San Francisco Psychedelic Society. But he's good friends with and swears by all of James Fadiman's work and everything like that. So we were talking about that with him, and when you say microdose, kind of like what you're saying, some people take it as in like, oh, 0.5 or 0.75 or whatever, and then other people will think of it as like sub psychedelic threshold doses, like Maurice was doing like 0.1 or 0.2 or something like that. So it is kind of a variable, right? When people say microdose, it could mean many different things.
Yeah. Well, even if you take, super low doses, like you wouldn't be able to, to distinguish, the effects, from salt water or placebo pill. If you take that kind of microdose every day, chances are it's exerting a Prozac-like effect on your brain. So even if there aren't any acute subjective effects, you don't feel anything after you do it. You would think over time, like over the space of a couple of weeks or a month, there'd be an improvement in your mood. Maybe creativity as well if you were slightly depressed and not thinking as clearly as you might like.
What about I know, Maurice, I think, weren't you doing, it was like psilocybin and like lion's mane and reishi and all that kind of stuff too, or was it just psilocybin?
Yeah, no, I actually, the stuff that I was directed by that Adam dude, again, I don't know all the legalities and everything, so I want to watch what I say, but yeah, it was I think it was like 8 different types of mushrooms, one of them being psilocybin. So I think the whole mixture was around .3, the weight of all the mushrooms combined. But yeah, obviously there's studies that show that lion's mane and different type of fungus can help with like your attention and staying focused and all that stuff, energy, so I liked what I was getting from him, because it wasn't just, oh, take this little bit of take a piece of this cap or something. There was actually a formula, a method to it all. So yeah, it was a combination. I can't remember exactly. I mean, we should have him on the show again. I reached out and he was kind of busy, so maybe I can line that up and we'll get him back on. But yeah, I think that there's tons of beneficial things, psilocybin being one of them, but obviously we know from all the legal mushrooms that there's other stuff that's good for the body.
Yeah, well, those are the kinds of questions that should be experimentally studied, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the combinations, and I mean, Paul Stamets does a great job of breaking down all the mushroom stuff too and the benefits. And like we're saying, like even if you're listening and you don't want to take anything psychedelic, even the like lion's mane is supposed to be super good for you, reishi, there's a few different types. The one that I find interesting is the one Paul talks about too, that grows in like the old growth forests of Washington, called agarikon. Supposedly like the Greeks knew about it from like the healing properties of it and stuff like that too. So I'm interested to see some of the more studies done on that one as well.
Yeah. Well, so Paul's the man.
Yeah, he's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's psilocybin. We did dabble in the LSD thing a little bit. The LSD thing from because I've talked about it many times. Obviously, my OCD and mental health issues. I think that's why I didn't love the LSD. It was a heady experience, and I'm already in my head most of the time. So I feel like that it didn't like amplify that aspect of it, but what it did do was, when you get into a thought loop in OCD, sometimes it's hard to break free of it. But then with the LSD aspect of it, like I said, you just kind of go down some paths and, go through some things. Obviously, reliving trauma or things like that can be definitely therapeutic. But knowing my own mind and stuff like that too, there's also some unpleasant aspects of it too. So I do really think that there's something to our connections with these compounds. I think that it's like some people have just this, whether it's their physiology or their mind or whatever it is, we do have these connections to specific compounds. Aside from your work with DMT, do you have something like your spirit compound or your spirit animal of psychedelics?
Well, I do like mushrooms. If I were to trip, and I like ayahuasca too. It seems like especially healing, physically. Quite profound physical healer. Um, yeah, and it's a big trip. And well, most of the ayahuasca that I've drunk was within the UDV, one of the federally approved Brazilian churches, which use ayahuasca as a sacrament. So that is tripping in a specific container, a large group of very nice people and very strong tea, and a specific protocol. I mean, you're under lights and you're sitting in chairs. There's a master of ceremonies up front. That provides provides sermons and answers questions, and manages the music and the silence. So I got quite a bit out of participating in those ayahuasca ceremonies. I speak or feel quite highly about that setting, and the tea itself is fresh and organic.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mentioned this before. Thinking about it, I don't know if I would ever be down to do a ceremony with other people, just because, I don't know, maybe I'm just a weirdo. But I feel like I'm always just more comfortable alone in darkness, like some sort of,
That's
solo,
intense, bro.
solo tripping. I just feel like I learned most about myself. And there's probably something to be gained too from being around other people. But I feel like what I'm trying to achieve through the experience cannot be achieved with the interplay between other people, because I'm not trying to understand other people from that sense. I'm trying to understand myself and play off of my own ideas and philosophies and things like that, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a completely different experience if you're in a group, because you're participating in everybody else's trip. So if it's a cohesive group, it can power things in a particular direction. Just like a meditation retreat. But if it's a chaotic group, just a mess, then it's bad news.
Absolutely. So we touched on psilocybin, we touched on LSD. What about MDMA? So like I know that this one's kind of a little bit more dicey in terms of the physiological effects. It's not as physiological safe as psilocybin or LSD, but there has been huge steps to, they've incorporated this into PTSD treatments for vets and things like that, and they have great success. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, most of your listeners probably know about MDMA. Yeah, it's a derivative of your methamphetamine. I consider it a quasi psychedelic. There isn't the ego fragmentation, dissolution, generally anyway. With normal doses. Um, yeah, it's more of a stimulant. Raises heart rate, blood pressure, makes you clench your jaws and your eyes go back and forth, nystagmus, um, tremor, elevated temperature. Yeah, the therapeutic window, so to speak, is a lot more narrow, than is the case with the classical compounds. Um, in other words, there isn't that much of a difference between an effective dose and too much. And especially if you take more and more, either over the course of a day or over the course of your life. Yeah, and it works differently than the than the classical compounds. Like compounds like LSD bind to receptors for serotonin, and MDMA releases serotonin and dopamine from nerve cells, and that can be overdone, and you can burn out those neurons if you are exposed to you know uh, you know too high a dose, or more prolonged exposure over time. So the neurotoxicity of MDMA is a real concern, which I think is going to limit its applicability. If you're in a protocol, where you take MDMA in combination with psychotherapy, like 3 times, once a month, let's say, I think you're okay. It's a question of the risk, I, versus benefit as well. If you've got an intractable case of PTSD, if you've tried everything without success, if you're really disabled as a result of your symptoms, then the risk, I think, is mitigated by the potential benefit. But if you just want to trip and party and have fun, or take a walk in the woods, I suppose it would be okay to take MDMA maybe once or twice at a modest dose, but and it can help introduce people to the psychedelic state if they're afraid of the full blown effect of a big dose of psilocybin or of LSD. Y- 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 uh, that being said, you can still kind of deal with anxiety about a big trip with classical uh, compound, by just starting off at smaller doses of LSD, or of psilocybin, rather than beginning with MDMA. And I think that the jury is definitely still out whether or not the classical compounds, either at full doses or at medium doses, aren't as effective as MDMA in PTSD.
That's what
It
I was wondering, because I know that they went down the road with MDMA, but is there something specific about MDMA, or could that neuroplasticity come from psilocybin or LSD or DMT or whatever?
it could, it could, yeah, and people have been kind of swept up in the MDMA enthusiasm, and you haven't been looking at other compounds. That's why this proposed study at UCLA is going to be so important, because y- y- they'll be giving DMT and administering psychotherapy, to veterans who've got post-traumatic stress disorder, and it may turn out to be as effective or ineffective or equally effective to MDMA. I think the toxicity of MDMA really needs to be considered when you're thinking about widespread accessibility. You'd have to
Yeah, I mean, I
limit
would
the
be very
dosing over
concerned
time.
about the MDMA because of what it does and how it releases endorphins and things of that nature. I just would be worried about the after effects of doing that to someone that has depression.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing though too is I think you said it's like semi psychedelic, and I would agree with that. I kind of relate it to ketamine. Not that they're similar, because ketamine's a dissociative, but in the sense that they're not fully like tryptamine. Obviously, they're not tryptamines, but they're not doing the same kind of things that traditional psychedelics would do. But then, I'll just say Maurice and I. The last time I took it, we were at a fish show, and I ate 200 milligrams, and so did Maurice, which is a lot.
Oh, the old jellyfish incident.
Yeah, and when I got home, I was still like really, really, really high, and I was laying in bed, and these sentient jellyfish were floating around me, kind of giving me these like messages and stuff like that. It was very bizarre. It was probably one of the most bizarre psychedelic experiences I've ever had. And I have done another entity experience I had was on MDMA and psilocybin, and stuff like that. So I have had other weird experiences, but that jellyfish one, the dosage, I was just I was under the grips of this thing for hours and hours and hours, and I'm probably not going to do it again. But it was definitely an interesting experience.
Yeah. So what were they telling you? The jellyfish?
It was like ancient knowledge type stuff. It was bizarre. Just stuff that I've like experienced in meditation, and with all these things, I try and take it with a grain of salt too. Like, is this my own subconscious and mind, or is this something external trying to give me a message? This is something I ponder regularly. I don't know. And I'm open
it's
to
like
both.
you have all the knowledge, and then when you come out of it, you don't remember it.
Well, this one I do remember a few things. Just I'm not going to go. Maybe we'll talk about it in the future. I don't want to go too deep into it. But yeah, very bizarre. And I've never had that other than the what's it called? Is it hippie flipping or is it candy flipping with the
Candy
the same
flipping,
thing.
LSD and MDMA.
No, it's MDMA and psilocybin. Is that hippie
Oh,
flipping?
I guess you could call that candy flipping,
I
or
mean, let's-
solo tripping, or flipping, or yeah.
If anybody knows,
now
please,
we're splitting hairs here.
Yeah,
please
yeah.
comment below if you have the answers.
I call
any-
it a good
yeah.
time.
Anyway, so
Call it
that
what you want. And then,
that I did have an experience with, but other than that, my other MDMA experiences, they were probably 100 milligrams, maybe 50 milligrams, things like that, were more normal. So I don't know if it was the dosage that did it, or if I opened some sort of portal in my mind. I don't know what was going on, but it was very bizarre.
yeah, or it may have been spiked with something, or you may have just
I
kind of taken
I was
too much.
careful though. I did test it actually.
Okay.
You don't want to fuck around with powders these days.
No, there's a lot of bad powders out there. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
But yeah, interesting stuff nonetheless. So what I want to do here now is I want to ask a few questions. We are going to do a Patreon segment with Rick after we're done here, where I have a bunch of more questions from other people. But I wanted to get to a couple questions because I don't know if these people are Patreon members. So from Twitter, Terrence McKenna's dad, that's the Twitter handle, said,
McKenna's dad, funny.
I would like to
Mr.
know.
McKenna.
Yeah, he wants to.
Good name.
He wants to know about what's going on with the extended stay DMT stuff. Has there been any advancements or updates on that? And what's the difference between the DMTX and ayahuasca? And also, yeah, so I mean, like those two things. Like, what is there any updates on DMTX, and is there any difference between DMTX and ayahuasca?
Yeah. Well, because you don't develop tolerance to repeated dosing of DMT, I suggested at the end of the DMT book, The Spirit Molecule, that if you want to spend more time in the DMT state, for whatever reason, you could develop an infusion protocol, where it's a continuous drip, more or less. And Andrew Gallimore and I, co-authored a paper a few years back, discussing that at greater length. And Andrew did some, pharmacological, modeling about, the beginning dose and the infusion rate after, the loading dose, so to speak. And the group at Imperial College in London, just completed a study, I think in 12 or 13 people, where they, continuously infused DMT for a half hour. And I spoke with one of the volunteers, and he described it as a very pure ayahuasca experience. The same DMT like effects, without the physicality of which is part of the ayahuasca experience. Um, So they were giving, psychedelic doses of, DMT in, that infusion study. I'm consulting with a group in Canada, which is called Algernon, and they're interested in small doses of DMT to treat stroke and to speed recovery from stroke. And they're, working on a, protocol to infuse, sub-psychedelic doses of DMT over the space of 6 hours in normal volunteers at first, and then once that's worked out, to start to see if it can help in reducing stroke size and speeding up recovery. I think there might be a German study with a continuous infusion. I've just heard rumors. I haven't heard or seen any data from the German group yet.
Yeah, interesting. I know. Yeah, the goal is to like map these spaces out and see if if these entities are actually giving some sort of information. Because I know, from people that have talked about this, specifically from your books and your documentary and stuff like that, that it seems like it's just not long enough, or or do you think that it's an element of like what happens in our dreams, where maybe it's vivid, or you can remember it for the first like 15-20 minutes when you wake up, but then you start to lose it. It's like a fleeting thought at that point. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, you need to record it as quickly as you can as you come out of it, especially if you just, if you just smoke it one time or inject it one time. Yeah, the memory fades quite quickly. That's, that was, one of the, boons of our study, giving DMT is, like I was just, sitting by the bedside, and, volunteers would open up their eyes and, start talking, and I would start, taking notes and asking questions. So they were able to remember things, clearly, and I could, jog their memory about certain things, based on other stories I heard from other volunteers. Um, yeah, and I think if you're in that state for a longer period of time, you wouldn't be, quite as startled or rattled or disoriented as you're going in, and then coming out. It would be more leisurely. You can map out the state, I think, more carefully in that extended state protocol. You could also do psychotherapy using that model as well. Um, you could lower the infusion rate if you didn't want your patient to be too high, or you could even stop the infusion and they'd be completely normal in 5 or 10 minutes, and you could talk. If they want to really go for it, you could give them a, or you can speed the infusion rate up, for prearranged amount of time, and then come down and uh, talk about it. So I think it would provide a unique psychotherapy, psycho therapeutic tool as well. Um, when we were doing our studies, and the tolerance data came out, that people were not tolerant, or developing tolerance. I wrote to NASA. This was in the early 90s, and I said, your astronauts are going to be pretty bored on the way to Mars. Maybe you could just keep them in a DMT state for a few years. And obviously, I've never heard back from them. Yeah, but
They
that
didn't like
idea,
that
I
one.
think, is gaining some currency again. I
Yeah.
was seeing some news articles or opinion pieces saying, oh, outer space travel, uh, astronauts uh, are you're going to need something to do, or the neuroplasticity will be beneficial.
Well, that's what all the
So
movies, right?
that
They all go into a hyper, your a whatchamacallit, they get cryogenically frozen and then thawed, or they become sedated, kind of like what you're talking about. So like in all the sci-fi movies, they're already doing that kind of stuff. So
yeah, it's just an extension of literature into reality.
Yeah, actually, Spooky just commented and said candy flipping is LSD and MDMA, and hippie flipping is MDMA and psilocybin. So I guess it was
Oh,
hippie
hippie
flipping.
flipping. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Spooky. So one more question before we wrap it up. This actually comes from Dr. Michael Masters, who's a biological anthropologist from Montana Tech. He's in our documentary, which it's no secret. Rick Strassman's in our documentary as well, along with Andrew Gallimore and a lot of amazing thinkers on this topic, which we are going into editing mode now, which Maurice will be fully immersed in that. He will be doing less episodes on Mind Escape, but we'll talk about that at another time. But Dr. Michael Masters wanted to know, he was reading your book, and he said in I think he was talking about Spirit Molecule, chapters 14 and 15, you talk about a couple DMT subjects who encountered beings and entities who said something like, this is your future, there are many levels of humans, etc. He wants to know, because he's an author as well as an academic, and he's written a couple books. His first book was Identified Flying Objects, where he goes through the temporal aspect of it and thinks that the flying saucers are time machines and the gray archetype is us from the future. He just recently wrote a new book called The Extraterrestrial Model as well, where he kind of goes through all the variations of that as well. But he wants to know that, let's see here, if there's an overlap between like abductions and DMT trips. Maybe the very distant future, humans, evolve a timeless consciousness where they're able to interact with us in this ethereal realm, and that maybe our minds, or minds that are open or have left the body to some extent during a DMT experience are able to interact. What do you think about that?
Well, there is a striking similarity between a lot of features of the abduction experience and of the DMT state. There's this inner pressure. There's a sound. You burst into this like completely different space. There are intelligent beings that interact with you. Um, so but there clearly are no stigmata or implants or things like that. Whitley Strieber and I did an interview, very early on after the Spirit Molecule book came out, 2001, I think. And, Whitley wrote the book Communion, which was, like a classic abduction book. And, we batted around the idea of, physical encounters, in which case, there's stigmata and implants and things. And I didn't have much of an opinion about how those work one way or the other. But then in the course of our discussion, we were talking about consciousness, to consciousness abductions or encounters, and it's a viable hypothesis, I think, that DMT either administered or elevated naturally in the brain, uh, could change the receiving characteristics of the mind-brain complex in order, or to allow us, to make contact with different levels of reality, dark matter in particular. Those are quite difficult studies to do. They may take a few 100 years to put into effect, but still,
If we make it that far.
if we do make it that far, yeah. So yeah, it could be that there are things out there that we don't normally perceive, and when the perceiving attributes of the mind brain complex are altered, then perceive them, and it's like a microscope or like a telescope. Those things are always there, but you need some technology in order to see them.
Yeah, I mean, I've had mystical experiences, UFO experiences, orb experiences, entity experiences, but I've never been abducted. And, one thing I can say though, from interviewing tons of people, that there is some, like you said, crossover. One interesting thing I mentioned, and we have a clip of this on our channel from when we had Dick Kahn on, who is the author of DMT and the Occult Mind, where he is going. I don't know if you're familiar, but he was like featured on Vice. He smoked like DMT like 300 times in a couple years or something like that, and recorded it kind of like even though he's not a scientist, in like a scientific manner. Still pretty level-headed. I've met space cadets that have done far less. So shout out to Dick wherever you are. But the one interesting thing is we have a clip from when we're interviewing him, and he's describing this one DMT experience where these beings are like operating on his mind and like doing different things. And there's like a level of, it definitely felt like he was describing a abduction experience from having talked with a lot of people on that UFO and alien subject as well. So I think there is some sort of crossover there. I don't know what that would be. Maybe that's the mechanism for how these things interact, or maybe it's our subconscious projecting future things and events. I don't know, but I just thought that was a great question by Dr. Michael Masters, because I do think that there is some connection there.
Yeah, there could be. The approach that I've been taking when discussing if these things that we're interacting with are, within us or external to us, I like to kind of use the more generic term of previously invisible. And that covers all the bases. It could be unconscious, subconscious material, or it could be things that that exist in the outside world that we now can perceive.
Absolutely, I agree with that. I think that there's just so much that we don't understand, and actually a great book that kind of breaks that down is John Keel's Operation Trojan Horse, where he goes through and kind of just explains like our perceptions and things around us and the different wavelengths and rays and different things like that. So even though there's woo in there, I think that there's a lot of good information too when you're perceiving the mystical and the metaphysical things as well. But before we get out of here, Maurice, do you have any other questions?
Oh man, again, it's always a nice educational opportunity here, and I've learned a lot, and I really enjoy having you on, Rick, and we appreciate your time.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I always like to spend time with you guys too.
Yeah, and if you're interested, actually, the part 2, or the last episode we did with Rick and Maurice were going back and forth with film, and we got probably our best feedback on you guys talking about movies. So maybe we'll have you on in the future, and you guys can just chop it up on films and movies and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I'm currently going through Squid Game. That's pretty intense.
Yeah,
I haven't seen that one yet.
Oh, you got to check that out, Maurice. I kind of predicted it, but I'm not going to spoil it for anybody.
No spoilers. Yeah. It's quite emotional.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Nice. I'm pumped up.
Yeah, and I just finished watching The Haunting of Hill House, which was great until the finale. It was a dud finale.
Yeah, my wife.
I don't remember the finale, but I do remember there is some creepy moments. I like that one too.
My wife made me watch that. I didn't really love that. I wasn't against it. It just wasn't. Yeah, there is a lot of great stuff.
You were afraid of the man in the hat. I know.
Oh yeah,
that's a very common archetype for people.
I know. That's why the writing is pretty good. There's like real things that are intertwined. I don't remember what the finale was, so maybe I blocked out the bad parts, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it turns into a friendly house. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure it does.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if
speaking of DMT in the media, there was a series by Mike Flanagan as well, which is called Midnight Mass, and
we've seen
there's some discussion between a couple of the main characters about what happens after you die.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, and they start talking about DMT.
Yeah.
To death. I went, right
Yeah.
on.
I liked that. Maurice didn't love it so much, but
it was decent. It's the same people that did the Hill House
yeah,
thing.
the guy you're talking about, I think, is the main guy from Friday Night Lights, the show. The
He's really
quarterback
taking
guy.
a turn.
He breaks down. I was shocked when I was watching it because I didn't even hear about the DMT thing when I started watching, and then I like, this guy's talking about DMT and dying. This is crazy.
It was news to me. I was startled. I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I like it. I think it's a great series to break down something that seems like it should be obvious, but it's not obvious. Do you know what I'm saying? Like even though I kind of knew what's going on, I'm sure you did too, there was elements of it where it's like, I didn't think about that phenomenon in this way, but I kind of do now, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and concentrations of DMT go up in the dying brain, especially in the visual cortex. So that's pretty strong evidence. For DMT at least playing some role in the phenomenology of the near-death state.
Absolutely. So yeah, if you're interested, the first episode we did with Rick was very scientific-based, mechanical. I thought it was a great interview, the first one we did, but very mechanical, scientific. Second one, very loose, metaphysical, film talk, great episode. And I thought this was a great episode too. And if anybody's interested, and you should be interested, please go check out Rick's new book, The Psychedelic Handbook. I think it's like a great, there you go. It's a great guide. If you're an experienced psychonaut, there might be not a ton of new stuff, but even me who knows a ton about a lot of this stuff, I still learned a bunch of stuff. So go check it out. And if you're looking to get somebody into this, or somebody is interested, or they have mental health issues and they want to read up on it or whatever, I think this is a perfect guide. So I think that you should recommend that to people that aren't as experienced and people that are trying to get into it or want to learn more about it. I think that this book's really going to speak to them, and I think they'll come away with being more comfortable about the topic. So I think that this book was really needed because I don't really see anything else that's like that out there. So go check that out. I have the link down below. Check out Rick's website if you want to interact with him. He's pretty active on Facebook, and I've been talking with him. We're going to try and get him more active on Twitter and a couple other things. So hopefully look for that in the future. And if you want to support Mind Escape, follow us on all social media stuff. I have the Linktree link down below. We've got a Patreon. We're about to do a Patreon segment with Rick, and we've got one from his previous episode that he was on as well. It's a good way to support the show is just to leave us a nice 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So, Rick, I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate you contributing to our documentary, and I think that you're not only are you the godfather of DMT experiments, but you're also a great ambassador for this topic because you kind of look at it from all angles, and you don't really have like an agenda one way or another, which I really appreciate. So,
well, thanks. Nice to hear.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Well, as we wrap up, the one thing we always say is, I love everybody and stay safe out there. Peace.
Peace.